Now for the dramatic reveal. It was me. You probably knew it. I don't know how people know. I saw somebody today and I realized I'm wearing a mask. How are they going to know it's me? And they knew it was me right away. I don't know if there's something about me that's just, oh, I know who that is. I don't know. That's not a good thing. I guess I'll never be a bank robber or anything. So normally this would be the last class of our term, but if you remember, we had to cancel one Wednesday night. So we actually, for our class, have one more class. We're going to go ahead and do it next Wednesday, even though we would be starting a study in the book of Numbers at that time. But we're going to push that 1 week, and we'll just see if we can't snowball and end up about 5 or 6 weeks behind at some point. We'll kind of compress the next classes. Samantha and Kate, it's been great having you guys here with us. We're gonna move you out though. We're gonna get you back to your own class again next week. So looking forward to that. You've got Rob as your teacher, so I don't know what to tell you there. That's a mixed bag of eggs, so to speak. That's not the term, but I don't know what it is. So very good to have everybody with us tonight, and we got our group online too. We're glad to have them with us as well. And we're going to be talking tonight about a subject that too often we don't get into. I think once in 15 years I did a class, or actually it's just a series of lessons, like 4 lessons on geography in the Bible. And yet I think geography is fascinating and important. In fact, I'd say to you that in geography is one of the few things that I think the Bible implies we should have some kind of knowledge of, some kind of idea about whenever we're listening to the things that the Bible is talking about. And the Bible is very good to explain things to us so that we can visualize things that we're not necessarily seeing. So tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about geography. We're going to see how geography manifests a fantastic evidence for the veracity, for the authenticity of the Bible, and the authors who wrote it. And so that's what we're going to spend a few minutes of our time on tonight. Before we get started, though, Anthony, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
God, Father, so honored and so thankful, Father, for this opportunity to come and study your word. We're thankful, Father, for you created us in your image. We're so thankful for your Son to allow us to come and to go to that cross and die for our sins, shed his blood for our sins. We ask, Father, that we will have an open heart and open mind to study your word, that we can apply it to our lives. We ask that you would be a Brian as he teaches this class, and we also ask that you would be with the teachers and the students, Father. And most of all, Father, we ask that you would continue to guide us and continue to show us your love. We ask in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I mute my phone. It's terrible when your phone goes off, and it's right next to the microphone too, so that it's pretty clear. So let's talk about geography. What is geography, by the way? Just remind me, in case there's somebody who says, geography, what are we talking about? What is geography? I'm just going to pick somebody, and it's going to be terrible. So, I think Linda was saying something too, but no, not Linda. Land. It's land. Yeah. Okay. States. Yeah. So it's maps, land, places. It's not geology, which is a study of the ground, but study of Gregor throws out study of the Earth's surface. Right. Geography is interesting because geography implies a lot of history. In fact, you really don't get around to talking geography without talking history. Why are we called Portland? I'll tell you what, I'll give you a Brian point. If somebody can tell me, other than Wendy, who I've told many times at Grant and Daria, why is our name of our town, our area, Portland? Who knows? A flip of a coin. What was our town nearly named? Providence. Very close. Grant, Daria, Wendy. Boston. Yeah, we nearly were Boston, Oregon. It's kind of interesting, though, because it tells a history. It tells you a little bit about the two guys that flipped a coin, Boston versus Portland. Well, that tells you they were from New England, So again, geography tells you about things, about places. And I love to study geography. I've always found it fascinating. I've always loved Bible geography. I love the names of places in the Bible. The word Bethlehem means the house of bread. And I just always think it's such a neat word to say that's where Jesus would come from, the house of bread. And he would give us the bread of life. And those are just fascinating things to consider. Geography is fascinating, but it's not just that it's fascinating why we want to know about Bible geography. It's also important because it gives us a sense of testimony. Now, we've talked a lot about the skeptics and how a lot of skeptics view the Bible. Hopefully you understand by now that a great majority of the skeptics on the Bible, if you ask them, what do you think the Bible is? I mean, they don't deny that there is a Bible, but you'd say, well, what do you think this is? And they'd say, well, this was a book written hundreds of years after the events that they supposedly record. In other words, they would say that Luke's book of Acts was written centuries later. Well, in fact, I'll tell you what, it's at the bottom of your handout if you want to read this along with me. There's an interesting story about an archaeologist named William Ramsay. Back in the 19th century, 1800s. It's interesting, during that time, there was a lot of heavy criticism of the Bible. This was about the time that Darwin comes out with his theories, and there's lots of philosophers saying God is dead, and it became really popular for academics to begin trouncing on the Bible. That became something somewhat popular. I think that was modern, but that's been around a while. And so Ramsay was a man who, like many then and now, said, well, the Bible can't be literal. And his thinking was this. He assumed that the book of Acts contains geographical errors. And his assumption was kind of logical. His assumption was that if somebody had written this book several centuries after it occurred, and in the 19th century, geography is still kind of a new science. We're still kind of figured out. And he says, you know what? Whoever wrote this book, if they wrote it centuries later, they're not going to understand the places they're talking about and they're going. And so what he does is he believed no one could write accurately about the places where events had occurred 100 years earlier. He set out to disprove the scripture, but by beginning to travel through Asia Minor, what did he discover? You know the answer. He actually discovered that the accounts written in the book of Acts about the travels of Paul specifically followed a pattern both in the linear method, in other words, the places you were going one after the other, and the time, the chronology that it would take to travel by those means. Meaning, Ramsay realized this was written by somebody who actually made these journeys, and he turned around and said, Book of Acts is completely accurate. Now that's important. Like I said, I think for a lot of us, me too, we always took the geography of the Bible for granted. We didn't think much about Bethel or Jerusalem or places, we just kind of read through them. But where it kind of occurred to me once was years ago, I was looking at the Book of Mormon. And one of the things about the Book of Mormon, it claims to be an inspired book, and it tells a story of somebody making a journey from Israel all the way to America. And then the story's crossing rivers and oceans and places, and here's a problem. A lot of those places don't exist. They never existed. There were rivers in the desert, there were mountains in the plains, there were all these different things that were described. And in fact, if you type into Google, which is, the brain for half of us that we think with, you type into Google, geography and the Book of Mormon, you're going to pull up lots and lots of examples of how problematic it is. Because it's, well, we would say because of the way the Bible presents itself, it necessarily is the Book of Mormon is necessarily a fictional account by somebody who didn't actually know much about the region, who had never been there, clearly. So it's important to say that details like this give us something significant to look at. What is that special word that we've used several times that describes the idea of whenever something gives us enough information to prove it's true or not true? What's the special word that we say the Bible is fantastic for giving us this characteristic? What's the word? Falsifiability. Falsifiability. And falsifiability is the idea, it's one of the fantastic things the Bible does, particularly New Testament writers, because I think they were the ones who particularly want us to see this. I've got a couple other thoughts, inference or validity. Those are all nice terms to describe this. But the word I'm looking for here is falsifiability. Falsifiability is the idea that there are enough facts that determine something could be false. Police use it all the time. Somebody says, hey, where were you on the night of the 15th? And you say, well, I don't know. I was just doing stuff. I was just watching TV. And the police say, well, what did you watch? What was on? What happened? And they want details that they can then check and see if they're true or not. They're looking for falsifiability. So a good alibi, you ever want to commit a crime? I shouldn't say this online, but the criminals that are the ones with a good alibi create details that can be checked or something like that. They usually don't, and that's how they get caught. Falsifiability means you're presenting information that can be proven whether or not it's true. So the Bible, I've said this many times, the Bible is fantastic about giving us this depth of information, little tiny details that a lot of times we're just kind of read through and we're kind of not paying a lot of attention to. I do that a lot when I read about somebody's journeying and they went to this city and this city and this city. I don't think much about it, but what I'm actually seeing is a fantastic tool that the Bible gives us that wants us to think about this is true, and it was written by somebody who is who they claim to be, an eyewitness of these things. We've talked a lot about how important eyewitnesses are and how the New Testament especially claims to be eyewitnesses of the events that they are talking about, and their details are fantastic for that idea. Now, we had some questions tonight, so you can grab your questions if you have them written down or you're going to think about them. I asked you to tell me, talking about geography in the Bible, I thought let's just kind of start off broad, kind of refresh our brains. Give me 5 kingdoms. Let's do them one at a time. 5 kingdoms. Let's make it a little harder. Let's get their capital cities here. What do you got? Who's got one for me to start with? Monique? Assyria. Monique throws out Assyria. That's one of the important ones. Assyria. Do you remember the capital? Nineveh, very good. I would have also accepted Asher, but Nineveh is the capital that we see. Teresa gives us number 2. Teresa picks Rome, and the capital city, Rome. That's a good one, though. Rome is important in the New Testament, of course. What's another one? Another one. So there's number 2, Assyria, Rome. What else you got? Stephen? Babylon. And Stephen, what's the capital of Babylon? Babylon. Yeah, very good. So that's another one where that's kind of a good one. Now, those are the 3 easy ones. Now we're getting a little harder. And I tell you what, if you can throw me a city, a country without the city, we'll see what we can do. And Teresa picks up a good one. She says the kingdom of Israel. And the capital city, when it was the 12 tribes, was Jerusalem. So, you could have given me later, well, the kingdom of Judah was also the capital of Jerusalem. What was the kingdom of the northern tribes? What was it called? Samaria. You could have said Israel too, but Samaria. And the capital city? Samaria. How about that? So kind of a nice one like that. Got some others. Stan throws out Egypt. And here's a tricky one. I think the capital is Thebes. Actually can't remember. So Stan's kind of stumped me on that, but Stan's right. Egypt is an important one. That's one of the important ones to know. The Bible talks about a lot. Stephen Ruth reminds us of the city of Jericho, and the significance of that city. Anybody else got 1 or 2 you want to throw out? Persia. Persia is an important one. Grant, what are the 4 capital cities of Persia? Well, we've already mentioned Babylon, so you can't call that one. That's one of the 4. Susa, Persepolis, and the 4th one, I was like Altera or something. I can't remember. But yeah, so Persia's an important one too. Persia's important too. And Teresa got that too, the Medo-Persians. So very good. So there's lots of nations in the Bible. And at first we think, well, okay, we're lots of nations. But I want to show you something that I personally think is just really incredible about the breadth of particularly the Old Testament, but the Old Testament and New Testament. And I thought, well, maybe the best way I can kind of show you why I get excited about this is to kind of look at it for a second. So here's a map of the Mediterranean world. I wish, if I could have had a bigger map and a bigger screen, I would have. Just to kind of, I think it's just neat to look at maps. I like looking at maps. I always find it interesting. And I've often said one of the most fascinating things about the Old Testament is that so much of it takes place in such an important area and in important times. But when we talk about world history, I'm going to give you the history of the world in 45 seconds. What we're really talking about is an area beginning over here that sometimes we talk about as the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. That's the region where history kind of begins. The other most ancient of places is Egypt. We already talked a little bit about Egypt, but Egypt is also a place of great importance. Another place that was very important, but it's kind of interesting, they didn't really know much about it until the late 19th, earliest 20th century, was the Hittites. Kind of funny, they didn't believe in the Hittites. In fact, a lot of people were saying, well, the Bible's just wrong, until they found the remnants of that massive empire around that time. We have the Assyrians, who are also in Mesopotamia, but further up north. We have the Babylonians, who are kind of in the middle of these areas. Then we have the Persians, who are in what is Iran today. And this is our world history as it moves along to the Greeks and then finally to the Romans. World history in 45 seconds. But here's what I think is so interesting. The Bible, I say the Bible begins, I hope you mean that the story that we focus in on in the Old Testament is the story of Abraham. Where does Abraham begin? In the city of Ur. Now what's really neat about that is, we talked about this before, it's an ancient city, one of the oldest cities in the world. Now Abraham travels along and he travels over to Egypt, and he on the way meets the Hittites. And these most ancient of people are also the people that are in the time of Abraham, one of the most ancient men of the Bible, 2000 BC and those things. Of course, we know that his descendants leave Egypt. They establish the nation of Israel. That nation divides up, and then the northern tribes are taken away by what group of people? The Assyrians. Then the southern tribe is taken away by the Babylonians, and then they're set free by the Persians. And to the time the Old Testament ends, they're under the authority of the Persians. But Daniel, the prophet, by the way, who saw the end of the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Persian Empire, said one day there's going to be a great goat with one horn that's going to break into four. And he was talking about the Greeks and then ultimately even the Romans. Here's what I think is so interesting. And like I said, maybe not everybody finds it as interesting as I do. The Bible moves along through this ancient course that touches all the nations that to Western civilization, we say, these are the countries that kind of made who we are. This is kind of the story of the world. And the Bible is touching every one of these places. The Bible is reaching out and walking and accurately, following and being a part of these great and sometimes incredible moments, like the end of the power of Egypt, the end of the power of Babylon, the end of the power of the Assyrians. We see these things through the Bible. That's really incredible. It's not just that, somebody could say, oh, they wrote a fiction story. This is a story that the geography of which testifies that it was written over the time period it claims that it was written over, thousands of years. Not just by a couple of guys a few centuries after Jesus. This was something that the geography and the following of geography, or it wasn't a city that was around for most of what we'd say is the Old Testament. They would never have heard of it. Little details like that give us some tremendous help to understand that the Bible charts the rise and fall of nations. One of the fascinating things is you can just, reading through the story of the Old Testament, you see the decline of Egypt and the rise of Assyria, the rise of Babylon. You're just there. It really is remarkable how this happens. Somebody comes along and says, I don't think the Bible is very credible. They really haven't grasped that here is something woven into everything we know about human history. The Bible's right there, eyewitnessing all of it. It's really incredible. And for somebody to say they don't believe that, they'd have to discount much of human history. So let's kind of ask ourselves some questions tonight, again, to kind of spur our thinking along here. What are some of the thoughts about why the Bible talks about the cities that people are at? And there's more than one answer to think about here. In other words, we're thinking about ideas like, why in the book of Judges are cities named and why are they so important? Why are they named in the book of Genesis? Why are they important? What is the significance that comes about in different times and places for names of cities that people travel to in the Bible? What do you think? Like I said, kind of a broad question, but maybe there's some specific things you could pull out. Who's got something for me to start with? Grant, please.
I don't think this is the answer you're looking for tonight, but I think it's a really efficient way for the Bible to tell us a context of what's going on. Like in Judges, we just get an idea from, the number of cities that are mentioned, how big an event is going on, or how far people are going, or
I love that statement. Grant's statement, if you heard him, he said, sometimes they give us the context, and you gave us a fantastic example that in the book of Judges. I just forgot how many kings did it say at the end of the book of Judges? Or I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Joshua. Let's nix that. But to describe these many cities, I was thinking of Joshua as being an example of that too. All the different places he captured, giving us a context for just how big this area was, or just how many people there were, Canaanites there were. That's a really neat point. Really neat point. Teresa gives us this. Teresa says, how about reference and verification? Kind of an interesting point when you think of that. Of course, verification has been the big one we're talking about. We say it gives us a sense of the veracity of the speaker, but she also makes the statement of reference. The Bible loves to say something is somewhere. It says this is near this or far from that. And it loves to give us a sense of distances like that. Sometimes we kind of miss that. When you read that, for example, when you read that Jacob is sent out by his father to go find a wife with just his staff, and he leaves down at, it's not even Bethel, he leaves in Beersheba, I can't remember where he leaves, down in southern Israel, and he walks to Aram, which is past Damascus. When you look at that on the map, what do you realize? What do you think about Jacob? He made a journey across half the world with just a stick. You kind of think to yourself, there's something really remarkable about that. Who's got another one? What's another one, Lamar?
Well, as you look at the Old Testament, and the way God was really trying to set things up for the children of Israel, he would use the nations around them when they were being punished or whatever. So he would use the powers that he had allowed to rise to punish his children when they needed to be punished.
So here's an interesting example of that. So Lamar says, God is going to use the nations. And that's actually a really important idea in the Old Testament. One that I think is lost on a lot of people, by the way. So we meet the Babylonians for one of the first times with King Hezekiah. Do you remember the story? What happened with the Babylonians? The envoys come to Hezekiah, and they're next to nothing. They're very minor. What was it God said that Hezekiah was going to end up doing one day, or Hezekiah's descendants would? Do you remember? Who remembers? What would Hezekiah one day do? Or not Hezekiah, but really his descendants. These Babylonian envoys came, and Hezekiah showed them everything. God said, that's interesting. Let me tell you what. Those Babylonians, one day they're going to do what? They're going to take everything. They're going to take everything. Now, what's interesting about that is that at that moment, this is really kind of neat, Babylon wasn't a powerful country. In fact, Hezekiah receiving these envoys was nothing of substance, because they were really not any more powerful than Jerusalem in that moment, and that God was going to raise them up. What's really neat is this idea that in the Bible, God raises up nations that we meet their ancestors. We meet the ancestors of Moab and Ammon and all these places, and they're nothing, and God raises up entire nations, like Lamar said, just to bring about God's vengeance. Now, what's interesting, Lamar, is to what Lamar says, is that speaks to the idea that God puts instruments of wrath in motion far longer than we really can appreciate. And that's a lesson for us today to think about. That's an important lesson for us to consider too. Stan Malloy just reminds us that the Israelites God said, you're going to serve them. That's the language of Hezekiah there about the Babylonians. And that's really, really a remarkable thing to consider. Lisa makes this statement, and this is kind of important too. Lisa says, different areas have different beliefs and values. Maybe the best example of that, by the way, is which group of people? The Canaanites. Now, what's interesting about the Canaanites is that the regions that they occupied, the areas they had, God was intentionally going to destroy them because of their unrighteousness. This shows, Lisa goes on to say, this shows how universal God's word is. Now, what's great about what Lisa says is perhaps like a story of the book of Jonah. Jonah requires a little geographic knowledge. What's so interesting about the book of Jonah? Why is it that the book of Jonah actually gives, again, this credibility that the Old Testament wasn't just written by a bunch of people that were Hebrews in the time of Christ? Why is Jonah such a remarkable book? Where did he go? He went to Nineveh, to the Assyrians. Now, again, that's an incredible story. In that story, at the end of the story, who's kind of the bad guy in the book of Jonah? Bad guy. Who's the person that looks the worst in that story? Jonah. This is one of the fantastic things about the Bible. It's not a geography point. It's just one of the things about the Bible is the Bible doesn't glorify its heroes. In fact, the Bible is quick to point the failings of every hero that it brings forth, with the exception of Jesus. And that really is a fascinating thing. But another point. Stan says this. He says, when the Bible says they went into Jerusalem, until you had been there, it's hard to understand where things are really located. It's kind of neat Stan says that, because I think all of us have a sense of, to be somewhere, to describe how you encounter things in a city really is an important idea. Teresa's just adding to the comment on Jonah that what's so unusual about it is that God sent Jonah, the Israelite prophet, to the Assyrian Gentile nation. And that really is a remarkable thing. Next question. According to the Bible, what are some of the oldest cities? Not the 10 oldest. It's Genesis 10. What are some of the oldest cities in the world? Or the oldest cities in the world? What do you got?
Iran.
What's that?
Iran.
Iran. So Iran's an interesting word. A country. Haran. Okay, good. What else do we got? We got, Teresa says Nineveh, sometimes called Ninus or Nimrod. Starts with a B. Ends with Babylon. What do we got? How about, what else do you got in Genesis 10? Got another one, Ron? The cities, what I'm looking for are the cities that Nimrod built. So Nimrod built the cities, Asher and Nineveh and Babylon. So we've got these are the cities, the first cities that were built after the flood. By the way, it's kind of confusing whether or not the Tower of Babylon was actually built. The wording in the Bible isn't entirely clear that they actually finished the city or not. I'm not sure. But it is interesting that we consider that. So, one of the interesting things about the Bible is it gives us these very ancient cities. It gives us these things that are these very ancient cities built by this man Nimrod. So again, the Bible loves to give us lots of detail. Let's jump to the New Testament, just kind of stretch our brain here. What's the city that Paul is from? Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus. Now, what's interesting? What do you know that's interesting about Tarsus? It was a Roman city, a Roman colony. Now, what did that mean, Monique? You're right. That's true. So if you're a part of a Roman colony, that meant that your city was actually a part of Rome. Romans had a weird way of looking at things. It's kind of like saying, I'm trying to think of another way to describe it. You know how we have like an embassy somewhere, and we always say that embassy is American soil? Well, the idea was if it was a Roman colony, that city was actually a part of the city of Rome. It wasn't just a part of the Roman Empire, it was Rome. And if you lived in Rome, you had special citizenship. And of course, we're very familiar with that. But Paul makes a great deal of use out of those details. These are something important. Stephen Root throws it down. He was a citizen of Tarsus. Teresa identifies it as a Greek and Roman city. Capital of Cilicia. Stan makes the statement, it was a royal city staffed with Romans, therefore all the people there were citizens. And so again, these are important things that we understand that, as I said, also are things that gives the Bible some credibility. Let's kind of change course a little bit. There's one we don't think of too often. This was, I thought, a harder question. I don't think any of these questions have been too easy, but this was a harder question. What are some of the roads mentioned in the Bible? What are some of the roads? Rob's shaking his head. He says,
I had a hard time finding it.
I know, because you're not going to just look up and find road, a road.
There's the King's Highway.
That's good. That's one of them. So King's Highway is one of them.
The road to Damascus.
So Rob, I was actually trying to think of whether or not the road to Damascus has a name, and it kind of does. Teresa also threw out the King's Highway, the road to Damascus.
Street.
I didn't hear you.
Street.
Yes, very good. So the road to Damascus actually turns into Straight Street, and so that's kind of interesting. You could say that the Straight Street, street called Straight. By the way, look at the pictures of that. The street's still around. By the way, you can still look down. It's not straight. Isn't that kind of crazy? It kind of goes like this. I was looking at the picture. Maybe it's straight 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. But that's it. And one more. Stan actually mentions it. Stan mentions it by a different name. The name it's given in Exodus 13. Isaiah chapter 9 mentions it. And why I twitches like that is because I'm thinking. Anybody want to guess? God said, I don't want the Israelites to go on this highway because they'll get discouraged. Anybody remember what it was? Well, that's close. So the King's Highway runs east of Jerusalem. This one ran west of Jerusalem. So sometimes it's called the road to Shur, but it's also called, I'll give you some of the other names. Stan has it down, sometimes called the way of the Philistines. Stan uses a term I've not heard before for it. Stan says also called the way of Horus, but sometimes it's called the way of the sea or the highway of the sea. And in Isaiah 9, Isaiah references it briefly as well. The Romans called it Via Maris. That's what they called it. Two very ancient roads that kind of interesting that the Bible describes way back. Being these ancient roads that are mentioned. So it's kind of interesting to know that there's a couple of these roads that are talked about in the Bible that are important places to understand. But I tell you what, got some pictures of them here. So the way of the sea is this one that's purple that runs along the coast here. The King's Highway is the one that runs up through here all the way to Damascus. So there's another road, by the way, and it's kind of a controversial, not really, but called the Way of the Patriarchs, and they suspect that there was a road that ran from Hazor to Hebron straight up and down through the mountains because they noticed that the patriarchs traveled it so often. But I thought we'll just stick with these ones that seem to have these more specific ways. So these are some roads that are fairly well known and described. Stan also mentions the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So that's kind of if that was a road, and that's a good one actually. I'm not sure about that one. That's one that I'd be stumped a little bit by too, of how they might have traveled, the Israelites might have traveled. So these are all things that are kind of important. I want you to get your Bibles now. Let's go over to Acts chapter 27. I realize I had thought about starting with Acts 27, but I wanted to kind of work backwards a little tonight so that we'd see how much time we had as to how much I wanted to read this. Acts 27 is, of course, the story of the shipwreck of Paul, the shipwreck of Paul. All my life, I thought it was fascinating that for the book of Acts, so much attention is given to this one event. That while it's interesting in some ways, at first you might think, well, is it really that significant? In fact, you might be thinking this isn't the first time Paul's been shipwrecked. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I think it is, he mentions having been stranded in the sea before. So that account didn't get any kind of record for us. But this is kind of an interesting story. We're all fairly familiar with it. We're not going to read through it, but we'll see how it is that Paul is going to be delivered from his prison to Rome. So it begins in verse 2, telling us how it is that they sail along the coast. And they go to the city of Sidon there, verse 3. And verse 4, they go on to Cyprus, Cilicia, verse 5, Pamphylia, Myra. Then they board a different ship. They go in verse 7 and 8 to Crete, where it is Paul would later tell them, hey, we should stay here or we're going to be lost. Now it goes on in verse 13 to say that they began to go with a south wind close by Crete, and then a Euroclydon strikes them. This great wind that strikes them and drives them all around the sea. Now, we'll go ahead and stop here for just a second. Here's what's really interesting about this account, or maybe I should just say this. What is it about this story that is such a rich falsifiability? What's going on here? What are kind of some of the details that you can see that we just touched them briefly? What are some of the details that are really significant for you to catch here? You read through this, what are some of the things that you see that are really noteworthy?
Well, there's so many details about how to navigate this part of the waters and where it's safe and where it isn't safe. So as you read the account, you can actually see that there's some sailors or others that have there's no knowledge of how to navigate this part of it.
So I'm going to take this two ways, Lamar, and they're both really good. So Lamar made the statement that this shows us that I'll say it like this: whoever wrote this knew something nautical. Now we know also whoever wrote this was probably a physician by the descriptions that he gives us. But now they begin talking about things like casting off the tackle and cutting loose. I got to find my places. Cutting loose in verse 29, the anchors, and letting out the skiff, and the different little nautical things that are described here. Even the term Euroclydon is a fascinating term. So first of all, this is being described with details to sailing that we really don't have many records like this that really give this detail. Now, the second thing Lamar said pertains more just to the idea of navigation. And the idea here is that it actually describes where a ship would go from place to place, particularly at the time of year that it's telling us that they went. So this is kind of an important idea. I'm going to grab a couple of comments here that we've got popped up. Teresa says, where they were going to and from is an important detail. And what's really neat about that, again, is that it touches these things to describe to us a voyage by some cities that don't exist anymore. So again, this was the archaeologist who found, when he tried to see whether or not these things could be proven to be true, that there just weren't enough facts. Details of ships and routes, stormy events. There would have been journals or papers about ship routes, etc. So in other words, here they give these very specific details, by the way, describing even what the names of the descriptions of the ships. Ships may not have names, but they did have figureheads. And it's very important that we're told repeatedly which ships they were on and going about. Stan says, this idea of being driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea about midnight, was it Adriatic or Mediterranean? I can't remember. About midnight, the sailors sensed they were drawing near some land. They took the soundings. There's some of those nautical terms again, the fathoms that they found it to be. Again, these are all things that to a man who was a physician born in Troas would have been unknown to him, except that he was really there. That's the testimony. Stephen Root makes the statement, manifests were very common in Roman culture, or there could be a record of this vessel. And what's interesting is that's one of the things about the giving of the information to the ships. If someone said, I'd be curious which ship Paul sailed on, falsifiability. You have enough detail, you could find those ships. So these are some really remarkable points. So this is a long story. This is one of those times where we read something that's really big, it's really lengthy, and we might think, well, this really doesn't tell us a lot about Paul's, trial or Paul's preaching, or there's not much here. And yet there's the sense of what we're getting here is a fantastic way to verify this is written by somebody who went through this experience. So somebody comes along and says, I think the book of Acts was written centuries later. Take them to Acts 27. Show them and say, hey, look, this was an actual event that somebody actually experienced. And the details that they're bringing out here are tremendously important to understand, from things like what the cargo is to, how it is that they were getting ashore, and the remarkable things about that as well. These are important details. Geography of the Bible, fascinating thing. So to kind of wrap up here, kind of bringing ourselves to the end, geographic diversity, in other words, the distinctions in the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we're primarily traveling through the Middle East. Now, in the New Testament, we're all over the Mediterranean. Why is it that this difference, again, itself gives us some sense, kind of a broad question maybe. Why is it that this difference itself gives us some sense that the Bible is reliable? In other words, what if the New Testament had been written and they just took the same trips as they did in the Old Testament? What would somebody say? Grant?
Well, they all follow kind of the center of important things that happened in that time period.
Very good. In other words, what's really important to understand is, as Grant said, these things geographically rotate around the places that were important in the times they claim they're written. Again, testifying that they're there. Book of Mormon talks about the importance of New York 2,000 years ago. What's the problem? There was no New York 2,000 years ago. It was empty. And that's not unusual. There's lots of times. I remember watching movies and they talk about a city. And I think, well, you know, I remember reading a book, a Western once, and they're talking about a town in New Mexico. And I knew that town didn't exist when he wrote it. That kind of bothers me. You know, Wendy hates it when I say, you know, Wendy, they just said something wrong. She says, just be quiet. Don't say it. The Bible doesn't make mistakes like that, though. And as Grant said, one of the remarkable things is that the Bible rotates the accounts, or the accounts are always specified around the geography that is the significant geography of the time that it's in. And that really is something remarkable. Lisa Rue makes this statement. She says, I just thought about how geography could be a stumbling block for someone because of the fact that a lot of these cities don't exist anymore. There isn't physical evidence. Some may stumble because of this. Now, here's an interesting point. So there are some cities that are gone. Can you think of a city that's not here today that's in the Bible? Babylon's the first one I thought of too. What is it? Sodom and Gomorrah, a real important one. If we find those cities, it's going to be problematic. Yeah? So it's true. There are a lot of cities. Now, one nice thing is something like Babylon. Why don't we break a sweat about Babylon?
Because it showed up in a lot of other places.
Yeah, because Babylon is a very important city for, say, example, the Greeks who conquered it, or the Persians, or things like that. So a lot of times, even if a city doesn't exist anymore, and probably there's a lot of these ancient cities that are long gone. Stephen Root brings up Ur. That's a good example of a city long gone. It was long gone by the time of David. And yet, you know, again, like I said, that's what makes the record so remarkable. They're talking about it. But the point is that sometimes the fact that a city isn't there has no bearing on us. Now, sometimes there are questions about where is this city? Specifically, if somebody's from a certain city, we might not know it. One of the things the Bible tries to tell us a lot is it'll say, hey, cities change names. Can you think of any cities that change names in the Bible? What was the capital? What was Melchizedek's king city called? Salem. What did it become? Jerusalem. That was an easy one. But there's a lot of cities like that. Bethel. Was Bethel Luz before? Anybody remember that? That's right. Monique said it's true, so it's true. So there's another one. The Bible loves to give us details like that, to say like the city of Dan was renamed. A lot of the cities get renamed. The Bible loves to tell us, hey, this used to be this. It's giving us something else. Somebody else had a hand up and I missed it. No? Well, we're just about at our time. I got one more comment here. Stan Malore makes the statement of a logical progression from one place to another. And again, that's something really neat about the way that the geography of these places work. Geography of the Bible, like I said, we all kind of take it for granted. We don't think much about it. And yet, it's sometimes these tiny details just give us this terrific ability to have a confidence that the people that are talking about these things have seen these things, that these were things that they actually bore witness to, that they actually walked through. And sometimes, as I said, these attention to details, especially over the great span of the Bible, gives us this really deep sense of absolute certainty that the Bible is written by the people that it claims to be written by, that they were eyewitnesses of things that occurred over a great period of time, and that they have so much of this information accurate that as I said, more often than not, somebody sits down and says, I don't believe the Bible's accurate. They're coming from a position of absolute ignorance of the things that the Bible says. We'll stop here. We got one more class next week, and then we'll be starting off in a study in the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers. We're going to be talking about how the book of Numbers relates to the church in the New Testament. And so we'll be studying that in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks' time. Next week, we finish our study. Thanks so much, everybody. And online, we thank you for your time here, too.